they said a man's worth was measured by what he could hold on to, his land, his stock, his pride, but sometimes worth hides in what the world throws away. On the edge of a dying town, beneath a sky the color of rust, a poor rancher was about to make the worst deal of his life, or the best one. The air smelled of dust and regret that morning. Boots scuffed against dry earth as voices bargained over broken dreams. A bag of feed, his last, sat heavy on the truck bed behind him, and across the pen a horse stood alone. Ribs sharp as fence rails, eyes dull as ash. No one wanted it, no one but him. And that choice, that foolish mercy, would change everything. The auction yard buzzed with hollow laughter, the kind that echoed off tin roofs and empty pockets. Eli Turner kept his hat low, the brim shading his face from both the sun and the stairs. He wasn't there to buy. He didn't have the money for that anymore. He'd come only to trade, to stretch one more week out of what little he had left. The drought had burned his pasture to bone, and the cattle feed he carried was worth its weight in hope. He leaned against the rail, eyes drawn to the far end of the pens. The draft horse stood half in shadow, its coat clotted with mud, tail tangled, hooves cracked from neglect. Its head hung low as if the world had forgotten it long before this day. No one bid. The auctioneer's voice faltered, tired of trying.
"Useless brute," someone muttered.
Barely worth the rope around its neck, but Eli saw something else. Not strength, not beauty, just stillness. The kind that comes after losing everything. He knew that silence. It lived in him too. When the crowd drifted toward the next pen, Eli stepped forward.
"I'll trade," he said quietly.
The auctioneer frowned, squinting as if he hadn't heard right. Trade what? Eli hesitated. Then he lifted the small burlap sack from his truck, the last of his feed grain. This. A ripple of laughter swept through the yard. "You serious, Turner?" Someone called out.
"That horse won't pull a plough, won't fetch a dime." He ignored them.
The deal was made with a shrug and a sigh, papers signed with a blunt pencil on the tailgate. The horse didn't resist as Eli led it out, though its steps were uneven, labored. Up close he could smell the rot of neglect, rain-soaked fur and old wounds that never healed. By the time they reached the truck, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in tired gold. Eli stood for a moment, watching the horizon blur in heat and distance. The wind pressed against his coat, dry and warm, whispering of storms that never came. He didn't know why he'd done it.
Maybe it was a pity.
Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was that small, stubborn spark inside him that refused to die. The one that still believed broken things deserved a chance, as he loaded the horse and turned toward the long, empty road home. The dust rose behind the truck like smoke from an old fire. And though he couldn't see it yet, that dying day had already begun to glow with something new, something waiting just beyond the edge of loss. Before the dust settled over his fields, before the fences fell and the wells ran dry, Eli Turner was the kind of man neighbors nodded to with quiet respect. He'd rise before dawn, the glow of his lantern a promise against the darkness. His ranch wasn't large, but it was honest, a patch of earth where hard work still meant something. He built it with his hands, plank by plank, sweat soaking into the grain of every board, and for a time that was enough. He'd married young to a woman named Ruth who smelled like lilac, soap, and sunlight. Together they'd carved out a small life, modest but steady. Mornings were for coffee and the rustle of hens. Nights were for porch talk and laughter that carried across the fields. Eli had dreams back then to pass this land down, to make it thrive even in hard seasons. He believed in the soil. He believed in himself. But belief, like topsoil, can wash away when the storms don't come. The first drought hit soft, a summer that lingered too long, then never really ended. The grass turned brittle, the pond shrank to mud. Then came the debts, the repairs, the slow bleed of pride that money can't stop. Neighbors started selling off stock, moving to town. Eli stayed. He told himself it would rain next month, then next season, then next year. But each promise cracked like the earth beneath his boots. When Ruth got sick, he took her to the city doctor, driving 3 hours in a truck that coughed smoke with every mile. He came home alone. She was gone before the rain returned, but by then it didn't matter. The land was just as empty. Years folded over him like old newspapers. His voice grew quiet, his shoulders bent, his hands rougher, slower. He learned to live on less feed, less cattle, less hope. Folks in town started calling him Old Turner, the man who wouldn't quit even when the quitting would have made more sense. They pitied him, but not out loud. He'd still come into the feed store every few weeks, hat in hand, counting coins under his breath.
"That's all right, Eli," the clerk would say too kindly.
"Put it on the tab," he'd nod, eyes down, ashamed, but grateful. That tab was a silent ledger of faith, faith that someday, somehow, he'd make it right. The ranch itself had grown quiet. The barn leaned with age, its boards sighing in the wind. At night, coyotes sang where cattle once stood. Eli kept one horse, old and slow, more companion than laborer. Sometimes he'd sit by the fence and just listen to the creak of wood, to the whisper of wind through the dead grass. The silence was heavy, but he wore it like a second skin. And yet, beneath that silence, something tender still flickered, a faint mercy he didn't understand. When a stray dog wandered onto his land, he fed it. When birds built nests in the rafters, he left them be. He still mended fences, though there was nothing left to keep in. It wasn't hope exactly, more like a quiet refusal to stop caring. Some nights he'd find himself looking at the stars the way he once looked at Ruth, as if the sky might forgive him for holding on too long. Other nights he'd sit with a cup of weak coffee, tracing the grain of the table where her hand used to rest. People said he'd stopped believing, but that wasn't true. He still believed, just not in miracles anymore. He believed in endurance, in the kind of faith that doesn't lift you up, but keeps you from falling apart. So when he saw that broken draft horse at the auction, something in him stirred, not out of logic, not out of need, but recognition. Two forgotten things, both too stubborn to die. He didn't know it yet, but mercy was the only currency he had left. The road home was long and dust-heavy, winding through the hollow ribs of a dying valley. The truck rattled over stones, coughing up brown clouds that clung to the horizon like ghosts. In the rear bed, Brutus swayed weakly with every bump, the old rope slack between them. Eli checked the mirror often, half expecting to see the horse collapse before they made it home. When they finally reached the ranch, the gate leaned open like an old wound. The pastures beyond were little more than memory, patches of brittle grass, dry gullies, and the faint trace of where the creek used to run.
Eli parked beside the barn, cut the engine, and for a moment the silence pressed against him like weight.
The air smelled of dust and sun-warmed metal. He led Brutus out. Up close, the horse looked worse than he'd remembered. Ribs like piano keys under a torn hide, eyes dull and rimmed with crust, legs trembling from effort. Each step seemed borrowed. Eli untied the rope, guiding him into the old stall that had been empty for years. The wooden door groaned as it shut. "Guess it's just you and me," he muttered, voice barely audible. By evening, word had already reached the neighbors. The ranch down the road belonged to the Hardings folks who never missed a chance to measure another man's mistakes. Their boy Caleb came by riding his shiny bay mare, circling the corral like a vulture. "That's your prize, Turner?" he called, smirking. "Looks like he's got one hoof in heaven already." Eli said nothing. The boy's laughter trailed off into the wind, but the words stuck. Later, he heard the whispers at the feed store, the half-jokes about the charity case horse. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. just the kind of humour poor men use to feel less poor. He tried to put Brutus to work. The next morning, Eli harnessed him to the small plough behind the barn. The soil was light and cracked, easy enough for any healthy beast. But Brutus wouldn't move. He stood there, head low, breathing hard, eyes staring at some point far beyond the field. Eli tugged the reins, gentle at first, then harder.
Still nothing.
The old rage rose up in him, the one born from years of watching everything he loved turn to dust. He shouted, voice breaking, the sound echoing off the empty hills. Finally, Brutus shifted forward 2 steps, then stumbled and sank to his knees. Eli dropped the reins, kneeling beside him.
"Damn it," he whispered, not sure if it was to the horse or himself.
He ran a hand along the animal's neck, feeling the tremor beneath the skin. The heartbeat there was slow but steady, stubborn. He sighed, untied the harness, and led Brutus back to the shade. That day, he didn't plough another inch. Days turned to weeks. Eli tried everything, feeding him extra oats, brushing the mud from his coat, cleaning the hooves with the last of his liniment oil. But no matter what he did, Brutus remained the same. Quiet, distant, fading, but unbroken. Once Eli considered selling him, but no one would take a horse that couldn't pull or breed. He couldn't even give him away. The frustration began to rot inside him. Each night, he'd walk back from the barn, shoulders hunched, muttering to the darkness. "Fool," he'd say, half to himself. "You traded a meal for a corpse." There were nights he almost believed it. Yet something strange began to happen. The routine, feeding, brushing, checking the wounds, became less about hope and more about habit. A rhythm returned to his days, one that dulled the ache of loneliness. And though Brutus rarely moved, he always lifted his head when Eli approached, ears flicking at the sound of his boots on gravel. The horse's eyes weren't dead after all. They were waiting. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the rafters, Eli would light the lantern in the stable before heading back to the house. It wasn't much, just a faint yellow glow spilling onto the dirt, but it kept the darkness at bay. He told himself it was for the horse, that Brutus might settle better with a bit of light. But deep down he knew it was for himself. That light meant something was still alive out there. Something still depended on him. One evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, Eli stood by the fence, watching Brutus chew slowly through his hay. The light flickered on the horse's scarred hide, catching in the rough lines like a story half told. Eli exhaled, the sound dry and cracked. "Guess we're both useless now," he said quietly. Brutus lifted his head then, eyes meeting him. For a second, just a second, Eli swore he saw something there, a shimmer of knowing, a silent challenge. Then the horse blinked, turned, and went back to eating. That night, Eli left the stable light burning again. He walked back to the house through the hush of twilight, the air cooling, the sky deepening to indigo. Behind him, the faint glow of the lantern shone through the slats of the barn, small, steady, and undeserved. And though he'd never admit it, that single act of mercy, of leaving the light on for something broken, was the first good thing he'd done in years. Winter came without rain. The sky stayed pale and brittle, as if the clouds themselves had given up. The fields cracked wider, the soil turning to powder that sifted through Eli's boots when he walked. Wind carried the dust into the house, coating the windowsills, the dishes, even the pages of Ruth's old Bible that still sat open on the table. The words had faded in the sun, but he left it there anyway, like a door he didn't know how to close. Every morning began the same. Eli counting the scoops of feed, measuring what was left against how many sunrises they might have before it ran out. The numbers never added up. The hens had stopped laying. The well had thinned to a trickle. The barn roof leaked when it bothered to rain and groaned when it didn't. Each sound on the ranch, creaking boards, shifting sand, seemed to whisper the same thing. End. Brutus had grown quieter too. The weight had melted off his frame until he was little more than bone and hide. Still, he followed Eli from stall to fence and back again, head bowed but steady. There was no fire in him anymore, just endurance. The kind Eli recognized. Neighbors stopped coming by. The Hardings moved away. The others didn't bother to say goodbye. The road that led to town was empty most days, and Eli didn't drive it anymore. He'd sold the last of his tools, then the saddle, then the wagon wheels. All that remained was a single rifle hanging above the door, an heirloom from his father, cleaned but rarely used. He started skipping meals, saving the scraps for Brutus. He told himself it didn't matter, that the animal needed it more. But his reflection in the window disagreed. His cheeks had hollowed, his hands shook when he tried to lift a bucket. At night, sleep came in fragments, dreams of rain that never touched the ground, of hooves thundering across grass that no longer grew. Then came the night he couldn't ignore the truth. The feed bin was nearly empty. He poured the last of it into Brutus's trough, watching the horse eat slowly, gratefully. The bag lay flat in his hands, light as paper, useless now. He stood there for a long time, the lantern flickering behind him, shadows crawling across the stall walls. Something in him broke open, quiet but deep. He turned, walked back to the house, and took the rifle from above the door. He didn't rush. He cleaned it carefully, the way his father had taught him. The metal caught the faint light, gleaming cold and certain. When he stepped outside, the wind met him like an old friend. The moon was thin, a silver sliver behind clouds. Brutus stood near the fence, head low, ears twitching at the sound of footsteps. Eli walked closer, his boots sinking in the dust. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, not just from weight, but meaning. Each step was a confession. He stopped a few feet away, raised the barrel, and aimed at the space between the horse's eyes. His finger rested on the trigger, but he couldn't breathe. Brutus didn't move. He simply lifted his head, eyes calm, as if he'd been waiting for this moment too. Then slowly he took one step forward.
And another.
Until the cold muzzle of the gun touched his forehead. Eli's hands trembled.
"Don't," he whispered, voice breaking into the night.
But the horse pressed closer, the way living things lean toward warmth, even when it hurts. His head came to rest against Eli's chest, the weight of it soft, deliberate.
No fear, no resistance.
Just trust. For a long time, neither moved. The wind hissed through the grass, carrying the faint scent of rain that would never come. Eli felt the heartbeat beneath that matted coat, a weak, uneven rhythm still trying to survive. It was more than he deserved. The rifle slipped from his hands. The sound of it hitting the dirt was small, almost kind. Eli's knees gave out, and he sank beside the horse, arms wrapping around that frail neck. The sobs came slow at first, then all at once, years of silence, guilt, failure collapsing into sound. His face pressed into the coarse mane, his tears mixing with dust. Outside, the sky shifted. A storm rolled over the far ridge, lightning flashing white across the valley. The wind rose, scattering hay and debris, slamming the barn door open and shut like a heartbeat. Brutus flinched once, then stilled, keeping his head against Eli's shoulder. The rain began as a whisper, then grew into a steady drum. It wasn't enough to fill the wells or soften the ground, but it was enough to wash the dust from their faces, enough to remind them both that the sky still remembered how to give. Eli stayed there long after the thunder faded. When the clouds broke and the moon returned, the ground shimmered with puddles that caught the light. He looked at the horse, at the tired eyes watching him without judgment, and something inside him shifted. "Guess we're not done yet," he murmured. His voice was rough but sure. Brutus exhaled, a long, low sound like relief. When Eli finally rose, the rifle remained where it had fallen, half buried in mud. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he turned back toward the barn, guiding Brutus inside. The lantern's flame wavered in the draught, its glow soft and forgiving. He hung the horse's halter, spread the last of the hay, and stood there, watching the animal settle. As he reached for the lantern to leave, his hand paused. Then he left it burning. The warm light spilled over Brutus's back, turning the scars into something golden. Outside, the storm clouds drifted west, leaving the faint smell of wet earth behind. Eli stood in the doorway, breathing it in, tasting the difference between sorrow and surrender. Sometimes, he thought, the weakest thing teaches you how to stand again. Dawn came grey and cold, the kind of morning that carried no promise. Mist hung low over the valley, swallowing the fences and softening the horizon. Eli woke before the light reached the hills. Sleep had been shallow, broken by the groan of wind and the uneasy silence that followed. He pulled on his coat, its lining torn and thin, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet dirt, the kind that only pretends to hold life. Brutus stood near the fence, muzzle darkened by dew, watching him. There was something restless in the horse that morning, a nervous shifting of weight, a twitch in the ears, as if the world beneath his hooves was whispering something Eli couldn't hear. "Easy," Eli murmured, tossing a handful of hay into the trough.
"Ain't much, but it's what we got." Brutus didn't eat.
Instead, he turned toward the far field, the one Eli had long stopped tending, and started walking. Slow, deliberate steps through the brittle grass. Eli frowned. The horse hadn't wandered that far in months. "Where you going, old man?" he muttered, pulling his coat tighter and following. The field stretched out in dull shades of brown and grey, the soil fractured like old paint. Eli's boots sank into the softest patches, the kind that remembered rain but hadn't felt it in years. Brutus stopped near the centre of the field and began pawing at the ground, his hooves striking dry clods of earth. Once, twice, again. Dust rose in thin clouds around him. Eli sighed, his patience thin.
"Quit that," he said, waving a hand. "You'll break your leg in this dirt." But Brutus didn't stop.
The sound of hoofing against soil grew harder, insistent. Something about the persistence, the rhythm of it made Eli hesitate. The horse wasn't just restless. He was focused, digging as though something buried there mattered. Eli stepped closer, crouching to look. Beneath the churned dirt, something dull and metallic caught the light. A glimmer, faint but certain. He brushed it with his fingers, feeling the cool edge of rusted steel. At first, he thought it was scrap, an old tool, maybe a horseshoe. But as he dug deeper, more metal appeared.
A line of it curving, running deeper into the earth. His pulse quickened. "No," he whispered. "That can't be." He ran back to the barn for a shovel.
The handle was cracked, the blade worn thin, but it would do. He returned to the spot, Brutus still waiting, his sides rising and falling with patient breath.
Eli dug. The soil gave way reluctantly, heavy and clumped.
Each stroke unearthed more of the metal, a pipe, half collapsed but recognizable. He followed it with his hands, clearing the dirt along its length until another piece connected, then another. The shape took form, an irrigation line, long forgotten, buried when the old well ran dry decades ago. His mind raced. If these pipes still led back to the source, if the ground beneath hadn't caved, there might still be water down there. Not surface water, deeper, older, the kind that sleeps beneath drought and waiting. Eli sat back on his heels, staring at the discovery. The sun had risen higher now, light spilling gold across the field. The metal glinted like a promise. Brutus stood beside him, sides flecked with mud, eyes calm but watchful. "You found it," Eli said softly, disbelief curling through his voice. He looked at the horse, at those steady eyes that had seen him through hunger and despair. "You damn well found it." He got to his feet, heart pounding, and followed the pipe's path east, toward where the old well once stood. The earth was uneven, but the faint indentations guided him like breadcrumbs of memory. At the edge of the property, half hidden beneath a tangle of weeds and broken boards, he found the circular frame of the wellhead, rusted, forgotten, but still there. Eli knelt beside it, brushing the dirt away. The boards crumbled under his touch, revealing the dark mouth below. He leaned closer, straining to hear. For a moment there was only silence. Then, faint, deep, a sound like a sigh, the whisper of trickling water. He froze. It was real. The realization hit him like a heartbeat.
All those years he'd cursed the land, believing it had abandoned him. Yet beneath the surface, the earth had been keeping a secret,
waiting for the right moment to be found again. He laughed then, a raw, broken sound that startled even himself. It wasn't joy exactly, more like disbelief mixed with the ache of too much hope. He turned to Brutus, who had followed him all the way, stopping just short of the well. The horse lowered his head, snorting softly. Eli reached out, running a trembling hand along his neck. "You knew," he whispered. "Somehow you knew." He didn't realize he was crying until the tears hit the dirt. The day stretched long and bright as he began digging in earnest, tracing the old system, clearing paths, and marking where the pipes connected. Brutus stayed near, watching, occasionally pawing at the ground as if urging him on. By dusk, Eli's hands were raw, his back screaming with pain, but the hole was open, the well breathing again. When he finally stopped, sweat mixing with soil on his skin, he looked at Brutus one last time. The horse stood outlined against the sunset, body framed by streaks of orange and gold. For a moment, Eli thought he looked young again, proud, whole, alive. The wind stirred, carrying the smell of wet stone. Eli smiled, quiet and full. Fate, he said, almost to himself, had one more lesson to teach, and that night, for the first time in years, he left the stable light burning not out of mercy, but gratitude. The next morning came bright and windless, a rare stillness that felt like permission. Eli rose before the sun, coffee left untouched on the table. His hands were blistered, shoulders stiff, but there was something electric in his chest. The faint sound he'd heard the night before wasn't a dream. Beneath his feet, the earth was alive again. He gathered what tools he had, an old wrench, a cracked shovel, a coil of rope, and headed to the field. Brutus followed, steady as ever, his breath clouding in the early light. Together they began again. Eli cleared the last of the dirt from the pipes, checking for breaks, hammering rust loose, patching leaks with torn cloth and faith. It was slow work, crude and exhausting, but with every turn of the wrench, every shovel of soil, the sound of running water grew clearer. Days became weeks. The weather stayed dry, but Eli didn't care. Each evening the wind carried a cool dampness now, a whisper of what lay below. He rebuilt the wellhead, rigged a makeshift pulley, and lowered a bucket deep into the shaft. When he hauled it back up, the metal handle creaked, and cold drops of water ran down his wrist. He lifted the bucket to the light. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it shimmered like silver. He laughed breathless, then shouted into the open air. "We did it, boy!" Brutus tossed his head, snorting, stamping his hooves as if in agreement. Over the next months, Eli worked the land like a man reborn. He dug trenches, reconnected the irrigation lines, and let the water run wild across the fields. The soil drank greedily, darkening from grey to brown to a living, breathing black. He planted hayseed by hand, scattering it into the damp furrows, whispering to it as if it could hear him. "Grow," he said. "Just grow." And it did. By midsummer the fields were green again, not the weak, pale shoots of a mercy rain, but deep, lush growth that rolled across the valley like an ocean. When the wind came, it rippled the grass into waves. The sight stopped Eli every time. He'd stand by the fence, the same one he'd once thought of tearing down, and watch the land move like it had forgiven him. Neighbors began to return, drawn by the rumor of water where none should exist. They found Eli standing beside his horse, both framed by fields of emerald and gold.
"You did this?"
one of them asked, shaking his head.
"How?" Eli only smiled.
Didn't do it alone. Brutus stood behind him, his coat shining now, muscles filling out beneath it. The animal moved with quiet power, pulling wagons, carrying loads, working from dawn to dusk without complaint. It was as if the land's rebirth had soaked into him too. Soon, word spread beyond the valley, whispers of the man who found water in dust, of the useless horse that led him to it. A newspaper from the next county sent a photographer. The image they printed showed Eli leaning on a fence post, Brutus beside him, the field behind them alive with light. The caption read, "Hope found on Turner Ranch." Buyers came next. They wanted hay, grain, and grazing rights. Some wanted to invest.
Others just came to see it with their own eyes, the miracle in the drought belt.
The road that had once been empty now hummed with trucks. Eli didn't know how to handle the attention, so he didn't try. He sold what he needed, paid his debts in quiet installments, and saved the rest. For the first time in years, he fixed the roof. He painted the barn red again. He built new fences not to keep things in, but to mark how far they'd come. But through it all, one thing never changed. Every evening, when the work was done and the world slowed, Eli would walk out to the pasture where Brutus grazed. He'd rest a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the hide. "Couldn't have done it without you," he'd say, voice soft as the dusk around them. Sometimes Brutus would turn, nudging Eli's shoulder gently, as if to remind him it was never about ownership or debt. It was about faith, the kind that asks for nothing but gives everything. Summer bled into fall. The harvest came heavy, the hay sweet and gold. The ranch hands he'd hired worked long hours, singing in the fields, their laughter carrying through the valley. Eli listened, a sound he hadn't heard since Ruth's days. It felt like home. One afternoon, a wealthy cattleman from Amarillo stopped by. He wore polished boots and cologne that smelled like city glass. "Heard about your miracle," he said, stepping out of his truck. His gaze slid to Brutus, who stood nearby, tail flicking lazily.
"Is that your secret? Fine-looking animal?"
"What'll you take for him?" Eli looked at Brutus. The horse stared back, calm, unwavering. The rancher waited, a checkbook already in hand. Eli smiled, slow and certain.
"Ain't for sale," he said. The man laughed, thinking it a joke, until Eli turned away.
He left the question hanging in the dust like something sacred. That night, Eli walked out to the field as the sun slipped low, painting the sky with long streaks of rose and copper. Brutus stood on the hill, silhouetted against the dying light. Eli joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. Together, they watched the wind dance through the grass, the land alive, the world forgiven. There was no miracle, Eli thought. Not really. Just endurance, faith, and one quiet act of trust that changed everything. The fortune he'd found wasn't in money or water or land. It was standing right beside him, breathing slow, steady, eternal. And as the last light faded, the lantern in the barn flickered on, not out of habit but remembrance, a promise kept between a man and the one creature who never stopped believing in him. The first frost came quietly that year, a thin silver veil draped across the pastures. The air was sharp and still, the kind that made sound carry farther, clearer. Eli stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hands, watching his breath rise in pale clouds. Beyond the fence, the fields shimmered with a fragile beauty, the kind that comes only after survival. Brutus grazed near the barn, his coat thick and clean now, breath steaming in the morning chill. He moved slower these days, his steps measured, careful. Age had crept into his joints, but there was still pride in the way he held his head. Every now and then he'd lift his gaze toward Eli as if checking to make sure the world was still right. Eli smiled. "Still here, old friend," he murmured. The ranch had changed in ways he never thought possible. The wells ran strong, the fields full, the debts gone. Men came to him for advice now, calling him Turner the Lucky. But Eli knew luck had nothing to do with it. He'd seen too much loss to believe in chance. What had saved him wasn't luck, it was grace, the quiet, undeserved kind that arrives when you stop asking for it. He walked out to the field, boots crunching against the frost-hardened soil. Brutus lifted his head, nostrils flaring, then ambled over to meet him halfway. The wind stirred between them, carrying the faint smell of hay and earth. Eli reached out, resting a hand on the horse's face, fingers tracing the deep line of an old scar.
"You remember, don't you?"
he whispered. "The dry years, the dust, the way we almost gave up." The horse blinked, slow and deliberate, as if he did remember. Every ache, every hunger. Every night they'd stood together under the indifferent stars. Eli's throat tightened. "I thought I was saving you," he said softly.
"But you were saving me." He looked toward the far ridge, where sunlight was beginning to climb, spreading gold across the grass.
The land looked endless again, but this time it didn't feel like something to conquer.
It felt like something to care for, a living.
Breathing mercy as the warmth reached them. Eli's thoughts drifted back through the years, to Ruth's laughter, to the empty barn, to the first time he'd seen Brutus standing half dead in that auction pen. The memory no longer hurts. It glowed, faint and steady, like the light through stained glass. He realized then that life had never really taken from him. It had only stripped away what was never meant to last. Pride, certainty, the illusion of control. What remained was the truth, the broken things, the quiet ones, the forgotten souls. They carried the real weight of grace. He spoke it aloud, though no one was there to hear. "We measure value by strength and shine," he said, voice low and even. "But sometimes the worthiest souls come to us cracked, limping, and quiet." Brutus lowered his head, pressing his muzzle gently against Eli's shoulder. The warmth of that touch travelled deeper than words. A bird took flight from the fence post, its wings cutting clean through the cold air. Eli followed it with his eyes until it vanished into the light. He thought of all the years he'd wasted trying to be strong, when what had truly saved him was surrender to weakness, to need, to faith in something smaller and softer than pride. Behind him, the ranch lay still. The well creaked faintly, windmill turning slow, steady circles. Every sound felt like a heartbeat of the land, of the horse beside him, of his own long-restored spirit. He turned back toward the house, walking in rhythm with Brutus's steps. The frost cracked underfoot, sunlight stretching their shadows long across the ground. Eli didn't hurry. The day would come in its own time, as it always did. Before he reached the porch, he stopped once more and looked back. The field gleamed, alive with morning light.
"Thank you," he said quietly, to the land, to the horse.
To the mercy that had found him when he least deserved it, and, somewhere between the earth and the rising sun, he felt the answer. Evening came slow that day, unhurried and golden. The sun melted across the valley like honey, coating every blade of grass in amber light. The air carried the smell of hay and river wind, clean and full, a scent Eli hadn't known in years but would never forget. He stood in the open field, hat in hand, feeling the warmth fade against his skin. Beside him, Brutus grazed lazily, his coat burnished gold in the dying sun. It was the same field where they'd once struggled, the same barren stretch of land where the horse had nearly collapsed, and Eli had nearly given up. Now it was alive again. The grass brushed their knees, the soil dark and rich. Life had returned so quietly it almost felt like a dream, one that didn't demand belief.
Only gratitude. Eli let the silence hold for a while,
listening to the rhythm of Brutus's breath, the soft hum of crickets tuning for the night. He'd stopped trying to name the feeling that filled him in moments like this. It wasn't pride. It wasn't joy. It was something deeper, like peace, remembering where it belonged. He was still standing there when he heard the sound of a truck grinding up the dirt road. A young boy hopped out, maybe 16, hat too big for his head, dust on his jeans. He walked shyly toward Eli, eyes wide at the sight of the horse. "Mr. Turner?" the boy asked, stopping a few feet away. "That draft horse everyone talks about?" Eli nodded, hand resting on Brutus's mane.
"That's him." The boy hesitated, shifting his weight.
"Pa sent me to ask if you'd sell him. We got land up north and could use a strong puller for the wagons. Said he'd pay whatever you think's fair." Eli looked down at the boy, then at the horse. Brutus had lifted his head, watching the boy with mild curiosity, ears twitching in the wind. There was no fear in his eyes now, no hunger, no ghosts of the past, just calm, patient strength. For a moment, Eli said nothing. He just looked at the boy's eager face, at the long road behind them, at the endless horizon painted in firelight. Then he smiled, slow and kind. "Tell your pa I appreciate the offer," he said, voice low. "But some things ain't for sale." The boy blinked, unsure if he'd heard right.
"Ain't for sale?"
Eli shook his head, gentle but firm. "No, son."
"This one's mine."
"Always will be." The boy nodded after a moment, tipping his hat respectfully. "Yes, sir." He turned, walking back toward the truck, dust rising behind him like a curtain closing. Eli watched until the sound of the engine faded into the hills. The wind stirred again, lifting the dry grass in small spirals, catching the last light before the shadows took it. Brutus stepped closer, pressing his muzzle into Eli's palm. The old man's fingers curled around it instinctively, the familiar warmth grounding him like prayer. He chuckled softly. "You hear that? They still think you're for sale," Brutus exhaled, long and deep, and Eli swore it sounded like laughter. He stood there a while longer, the world quiet around them. The light dimmed until only the horizon glowed, a thin line between day and night, memory and now. Eli turned toward the barn. The lantern inside was already lit, casting its warm circle of gold onto the dirt. He'd stopped needing it to chase away darkness long ago, but he still lit it every evening, a habit of gratitude more than anything else. As he and Brutus walked back, their shadows stretched long across the field, merging at the edges, two lives bound by something greater than fortune. Eli stopped once more, looking over his shoulder at the land that had once been dead. The sky above it burned with the last traces of sunset, the color of forgiveness. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "Traded a bag of feed," he said, "and found a fortune that money could never buy." The wind carried his words into the open air, where they scattered like seed. Brutus nuzzled his shoulder again, and Eli smiled, eyes closing against the cooling breeze. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man who'd lost. He felt like one who'd been given back more than he ever deserved. As dusk deepened to night, the stars came out one by one, reflected faintly in the troughs of water, in the shine of the horse's coat, in the old man's eyes. The ranch breathed quietly, alive and at peace, and there, under the wide, forgiving sky, man and horse stood together, not as savior and saved, but as equals, both proof that even the broken can be remade when love decides to stay.